The auctioneer had been doing this for 22 years, and he had learned to read a crowd the way a farmer reads weather. You could tell within the first 30 seconds whether a lot was going to move or die on the block. Lot 14 had death written all over it. It was a 20-foot steel shipping container, ISO standard, the kind that crossed oceans, stacked 6 high on cargo ships before ending up forgotten in rail yards and industrial lots across the country. This one had been sitting in the Caldwell County impound yard since 2013, which meant 11 years of Kentucky weather had done their slow and patient work on it. The rust had started at the corners the way it always does and spread inward like a map of everything that goes wrong when metal meets moisture and time. 3 sides were covered. The fourth was getting there. The padlock on the double doors had corroded so thoroughly it had essentially become part of the door itself. The county inventory tag was barely legible. The ink faded to a ghost. Lot 14, seized 2013, origin unknown, status abandoned, origin unknown. The auctioneer had processed a lot of abandoned property in 22 years. Furniture, vehicles, equipment, the accumulated debris of lives that had come apart at the seams. But a container with no known origin bothered him in a way he couldn't quite name. It was like a sentence with no subject, a story with the first page torn out. He started the bidding at 50,000, which was the assessed scrap value. The crowd, maybe 40 men in work jackets and ball caps, stood with their arms crossed and said nothing. He dropped to 30. Nothing. 20. A man near the back coughed. 15. Somebody's radio crackled from a truck parked outside the fence. $10,000 for 20 feet of steel that might contain anything from vintage machinery to 11 years of accumulated rat nests. Still nothing. The auctioneer dropped his voice and tried humor. Gentlemen, it could be empty. It could be full of rats. It could still be a roof. A few laughs, no bids. That was when the hand went up near the middle of the crowd. Small hand, thin wrist. A woman in a gray wool coat that had been good quality once, maybe 15 years ago, wearing the kind of flat-soled shoes that nurses wear, because they have learned the hard way that vanity costs you by the end of a 12-hour shift. 79 years old, 5'3", white hair cut short and practical. The kind of face that had been pretty in youth and had traded pretty for something harder and more durable, the way good timber trades softness for strength as it seasons. $3, she said. The auctioneer blinked. Ma'am, the administrative processing fee, Loretta Vance said. I believe that's what you charge when there are no qualifying bids. $1 for the container and $2 for the fee. She had done her homework. He had to give her that. The men around her laughed the way men laugh when they think something is absurd, but haven't figured out yet whether it's absurd in an amusing way or an impressive one. Loretta Vance did not laugh. She stood with her hands folded in front of her and waited for the auctioneer to confirm what she already knew, that nobody else wanted it, which meant it was hers. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the crowd. Then he brought down the gavel. Sold. $3. Ma'am, see the clerk for paperwork. She was already walking toward the clerk's table. Here is what the men in that crowd did not know and what you need to understand before the story can go any further. Loretta Vance had not come to that auction looking for a bargain. She had come because she had run out of other options, and she had run out of other options because 3 weeks earlier, her daughter-in-law had decided that a 79-year-old woman was a liability that the household could no longer carry. The conversation had happened in the kitchen. Loretta had been in her bedroom, the back bedroom of the house on Sycamore Ridge Road that had belonged to her son Cresswell for the past 11 years, and she had heard every word through the wall, because the walls in that house had always been thin, and Margette Vance had never been a woman who bothered to lower her voice when she had something to say. She can't live here anymore, Margette said. She forgets the stove. Last week she left the burner on for 2 hours. She's a liability, Cress. This is my house, and she is a liability in it. There was a pause. Then Cresswell's voice, the voice of a man who worked at the Caldwell post office and called his mother every Sunday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it meant everything he said, and still somehow managed to say so little of what mattered. She's my mother, he said, and this is my house too. Your name is on the mortgage. My family's money paid it off. You know the difference. Another pause. Longer this time. Loretta had sat on the edge of her bed in the back bedroom and listened to her son locate his spine and lose it again in the space of about 45 seconds. She had not cried. She was past the age of crying over things she had already seen coming. What she felt instead was something older and quieter than grief. It was the specific exhaustion of a woman who had watched a pattern repeat itself and understood in some deep cellular way that patterns do not break on their own. They require someone to break them. She had started making calls the next morning. The waiting list for affordable housing in Caldwell County were 6 months long at minimum. Some were closer to a year. The woman at the Housing Authority office had been kind and efficient and completely unable to help. Social Security paid Loretta $1,340 a month, which was what 43 years of nursing looked like when it was converted into a government check. The cheapest apartment she could find in Caldwell was $1,100. That left $240 for food, medication, utilities, and everything else that a human life requires to continue functioning. The math did not work. It had never been designed to work. A woman named Bernice at First Baptist had mentioned the county auction almost as an aside, the way people mention things they don't expect to be useful. Sometimes there's property nobody wants, Bernice had said. Land, equipment, buildings. County sells it for the processing fee if nobody bids. Loretta had written down the date and shown up at 7:45 in the morning, 45 minutes before the auction started, because that was how she had always operated. You arrived early, you did your homework, you waited for the moment, and then you moved. She had looked at Lot 14 through the chain-link fence before the auction began, stood there in the gray March morning with her hands in her coat pockets and studied the container the way she had once studied patients' charts, looking for what was actually there, not what she expected to find. The rust was obvious. The sealed doors were obvious. What was less obvious, what she had to look at for a while to see, was that the container was sitting level. It had been placed deliberately, not dumped. The ground beneath it had been packed flat the way ground gets when something has rested on it for a long time and been meant to rest there. And the lock, corroded as it was a heavy-duty padlock, the kind you bought when you wanted to protect something worth protecting. She didn't know what was inside. Nobody did. But she had learned in 43 years of nursing that you could tell something about a patient from the way they had been cared for before they arrived at your ward. This container had been cared for once. Whatever it held had mattered to someone. $3. She filled out the paperwork at the clerk's table while the auction moved on to Lot 15, a disassembled hay baler that immediately drew 3 competing bids. The clerk was a young man with a careful mustache who processed her transaction with the polite blankness of someone trying not to show that he thought this was unusual. "You'll need to arrange your own transport," he said. "Container has to be cleared from the impound lot within 30 days. "I'll have it moved today," Loretta said. The clerk looked up. "Today?" "I borrowed a truck from the church." She folded her copy of the receipt and put it in her coat pocket. "And I don't like to waste time." She drove to the impound lot in the 2006 Ford F-150 she had borrowed from the maintenance deacon at First Baptist, a man named Gerald, who had handed over the keys without asking questions because Loretta Vance had been a member of that congregation for 31 years and had sat with Gerald's wife through 2 rounds of chemotherapy, and some debts don't get repaid in words. The truck smelled like communion wine and brake fluid, which was a combination that should have been unpleasant but somehow wasn't. The bolt cutters were from the church maintenance closet. She had asked Gerald for those too, explaining only that she needed to open a lock. He had not asked what kind. The impound lot was at the edge of town where Caldwell Hollow Road met the old rail spur, a flat acre of chain-link fence and gravel surrounded by winter bare scrub oak. A county worker led her through the gate with a glance at her paperwork and went back to the heated cab of his truck. She was on her own. The container sat near the back of the lot. In the late afternoon light, the rust looked almost amber, the way old things look when the light hits them right, and you stop seeing the decay and start seeing the history. She walked around it once slowly, the way she had walked around patients' beds when she was trying to understand something that the chart wasn't telling her. The container was 20 feet long and 8 feet wide and 8.5 feet tall. It had a serial number stenciled on the side, partially obscured by rust. The county tag was wired to the door handle. She stood at the double doors at one end and looked at the padlock. The shackle had rusted into the body of the lock, and the body of the lock had partially fused with the latch plate. She had seen this before, not on locks, but on joints. Arthritis did the same thing to bone over time. The solution was the same in both cases. You didn't try to restore mobility. You cut through. She positioned the bolt cutters, adjusted her grip, and squeezed. Her arms shook. 79 years old is not an age at which bolt cutters feel like an extension of your body. They feel like an argument between what you want to do and what your muscles are prepared to authorize. She reset her grip, planted her feet wider, and put her weight into it. The shackle snapped. The sound was sharp and clean in the quiet of the impound, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She pulled the broken lock free and set it on the ground. Then she took hold of the door handles, both hands, and pulled. The hinges screamed. 11 years of rust and cold and the slow welding of metal to metal produced a sound that wasn't quite mechanical and wasn't quite organic. It was the sound of something that had been sealed for a very long time being asked against its nature to open. Loretta pulled steadily, the way she did everything, without drama, without hesitation, until the doors swung outward and the late afternoon light fell into the interior of Lot 14 for the first time in over a decade. She stopped breathing, not because of shock exactly, more because her body made an autonomous decision that breath could wait until her eyes had finished reporting back. The container was not empty. This was the first thing, and it rewrote every assumption she had walked in with. The space was not cluttered. It was not dumped or disordered or chaotic in the way that abandoned spaces usually were. It was arranged, deliberately carefully, with the kind of organizational logic that spoke of someone who had thought hard about how to make a small space functional and had executed that thinking with precision. Along the left wall, workbench made of solid oak planking, scarred and darkened with age and use, with a cast iron vise bolted to the near end, and the surface stained with machine oil and decades of work. Along the right wall, metal shelving bolted directly to the container's corrugated walls, holding boxes, most of them cardboard, labeled in handwriting she was too far away to read. At the back, a folding cot, military style, with a thin mattress rolled and secured with a leather strap. A small side table, a straight-backed wooden chair, a kerosene lamp with a chimney blackened by years of use sitting on the table with the patient permanence of something that had been placed there to stay. And in the center of the space, covered by a canvas tarp that had stiffened with age until it held its shape like a tent, a large mechanical form that she could not immediately identify by silhouette alone. She stepped inside. The smell was old air, sealed air, the specific mixture of dust and metal and something organic that she associated with very old buildings and very old people. The kind of smell that meant time had been happening in here for a long while, slowly and without witnesses. She walked to the center of the container and took hold of the canvas tarp. It resisted briefly the stiffened fabric catching on the object beneath it, and then she pulled it free in one motion, and the tarp fell away, and she saw what was underneath. A sewing machine, not a household sewing machine. An industrial singer, the kind manufactured in the 1940s and 1950s for commercial use, black with gold lettering mounted on a solid oak cabinet that sat on a cast iron treadle base. The machine itself was massive, built for volume and durability rather than domestic grace. The kind of machine that weighed 80 pounds without the cabinet and could drive a needle through 3 layers of wool without straining. The kind of machine that was built in the language of that era to last. The needle was still threaded. The thread was a deep burgundy, faded toward rust at the spool, but still intact. The tension dial was set. The presser foot was down. The treadle, a flat cast iron pedal on a rocking iron frame, sat on the container floor as though someone had just stepped off it a moment ago and stepped back outside and was about to return. Loretta stood in front of the machine and did not move for a full 30 seconds. Then she reached out and turned the handwheel. It moved. Not grudgingly, not with the resistance of neglect. It moved smoothly, the mechanism rotating with the easy precision of something that had been oiled and maintained, the needle rising and falling in its track as though the machine were simply waiting for fabric. Someone had cared for this machine, regularly, methodically, with the knowledge of someone who understood that a mechanical thing properly maintained would outlast the person who made it. This machine had been tended by someone who intended it to last. She turned away from the singer and went to the shelving on the right wall. She pulled down the nearest box. Inside, folded fabric pieces of it, each piece wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled slightly at the touch of her fingers. Cotton prints, florals and plaids and ginghams in colors that were muted now with age, but had once been vivid. patterns that she associated in some unspecific way with another era. The kind of fabric you saw in photographs of the late 1940s and early 1950s, in pictures of women on front porches and children at church. She unfolded one piece, a floral print, small flowers blue on a white ground. The pattern was fine and close, the kind you had to hold near your eyes to see properly. She held it near her eyes. The breath went out of her. Not a gasp, not a dramatic intake of air, just the quiet departure of breath from a body that has been struck by something it wasn't prepared for, something that hit in the place below language, where memory lives before it becomes words. Blue flowers on white, small and close and unmistakable. She had last seen this fabric when she was 7 years old. She had not seen it since. She had not thought about it consciously in decades. But the moment the fabric was in her hands and close to her face, something in her that was older than memory and deeper than thought produced an image with absolute clarity. A woman's hip. A cotton dress. The sensation of pressing your face against that hip, against the warmth of the fabric, and breathing in the smell of laundry soap, and something underneath the soap, something that was just the smell of the person, the feeling of arms coming down to rest on your shoulders, the feeling of being held without being lifted, of being secured to another person through simple proximity, through the undramatic miracle of being close enough to touch. Her mother, Winifred Vance, Winnie, who had been there every morning of the first 7 years of Loretta's life, and then one Tuesday morning in September of 1952, had not been there and had never been there again. Her father, Harlan Vance, had told her in the direct and final way that he told all difficult things, she's gone. And the subject had been closed with the finality of a door being locked, and Loretta had grown up in a house where that door was never opened and had carried the specific weight of that closed door for 72 years. Why did my mother leave? She had asked that question once to her father when she was 9. He had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had spent the rest of her life trying to decode. Then he had said, because she chose to go and left the room. She had never asked again. Now she was standing in a steel container in the Caldwell County impound lot, holding a piece of fabric with blue flowers on a white ground, and her legs were making the unilateral decision to stop working. She did not fight it. She sat down on the floor of the container in the dust, with her back against the shelving and the fabric in her lap, and let her body catch up to what her mind had not yet fully processed. The light outside was failing. The March sky through the open container doors had gone from gray to the pale amber of early dusk. The air was cold. She had not eaten since breakfast. Her hands were shaking, though, whether from the cold or from what she was feeling, or simply from the physical effort of the bolt cutters, she could not have said. She looked around the interior of the container from her position on the floor. The shelving, the boxes, the workbench with its iron vise, the folding cot at the back waiting, the kerosene lamp on the small table patient, and the singer in the center of it all, black and gold, the needle threaded in faded burgundy, the treadle on the floor like a question waiting for an answer. A complete life. That was what this was. Not the debris of a life, not the remnants, but the functioning apparatus of a life that had been lived here, in this metal box, in deliberate and organized and purposeful terms. Someone had worked here. Someone had slept here. Someone had tended this machine and organized these shelves and folded this fabric with care and precision and kept it wrapped in tissue paper against the day when it would be needed. The day had not come. Something had happened and the day had not come, and the container had been sealed and seized and had sat in this lot for 11 years on top of the however many years it had sat wherever it sat before, and none of it had been touched or disturbed. Until now, until a 79-year-old woman with $3 and nowhere to go had put bolt cutters to a rusted lock and pulled open a door. Loretta sat on the floor of Lot 14 with the blue flowered fabric pressed against her chest and let the silence of the container settle around her like a second coat. Outside, the county worker had started his truck. She could hear the engine turning over idling, then the crunch of tires on gravel as he pulled away. She was alone in the impound lot in the failing light. She looked at the fabric in her hands. Then she looked at the shelving, at the boxes she hadn't opened yet, at the labels and handwriting she still hadn't gotten close enough to read properly. She got up. Her knees protested. Her lower back registered its objection in the clear and direct language that 79-year-old backs used when they had been asked to sit on cold concrete floors. She acknowledged the complaints and ignored them the way she had ignored patient discomfort when there was still work to do, not callously, but with the practical understanding that the work came first and the comfort came after. She pulled down the next box, finished garments folded with the precision of someone who took professional pride in invisible work. Dresses, shirts, trousers, children's sizes. Each one had a tag sewn into the collar seam. Not a brand tag, a handmade tag, a small piece of white cotton with letters embroidered in red thread. She held one close to the fading light from the open doors. Made for Alice Hearn. She pulled another. Made for the Briggs children. Another, made for Dewey Watts. She knew those names. Hearn, Briggs, Watts. Families of Caldwell Hollow. Old families, the kind whose names were on cemetery headstones and church donation plaques, and the faded awning of Briggs Hardware on Main Street, which had been a hardware store since before Loretta was born and was still a hardware store now run by the third generation of the same family. She stood in the container holding a shirt made for a Briggs child and a dress made for Alice Hearn, and felt the ground shifting beneath the particular and familiar shape of her life. Not the ground of the impound lot, a deeper ground, the ground on which she had built her understanding of what had happened in September of 1952, when she was 7 years old and her mother had not been there one morning and had never been there again. The labels were in the same handwriting, the same small left-slanting precise penmanship, the kind taught in schools that no longer existed by teachers who believed that how you wrote said something about who you were. She needed to read the labels on the boxes. She pulled the flashlight from her coat pocket. Gerald had thought of that too, had pressed it into her hand as she was leaving because Gerald was that kind of man. She moved the beam across the shelves. The box labels were in the same handwriting as the garment tags. Most were simply fabric descriptions. Cotton prints, wool remnants, muslin, pattern pieces. But one box near the end of the middle shelf was labeled differently. No fabric description, just 2 words written in the same careful hand. Business records. She pulled it down, inside a ledger. Hardcover, dark green, water-stained, along the bottom edge, thick with pages and entries. She opened it. The handwriting inside matched the labels, the same precise left-slanting script, and the format was consistent throughout. Date, name, item, payment, column after column, page after page, entry after entry. October 3rd, 1952. Alice Hearn, winter coat wool children size 6, 2 dozen eggs. October 11th, 1952. Briggs family, 3 school shirts, cotton broadcloth, 1 bushel apples, 1 jar sourwood honey. November 2nd, 1952. Dewey Watts, work trousers patched and resized. No payment. Family and hardship. She turned pages. The entries continued without interruption. 1953, 1954, 1955. The payments varied. Eggs and apples and firewood and preserved vegetables and occasionally small amounts of cash. The no payment entries appeared regularly 3 or 4 times a month on average, always with the same notation, family and hardship. No payment accepted. Whoever had kept this ledger had been running a business and a charity simultaneously for years, charging what people could pay and absorbing the rest without apparent resentment or record-keeping regret. Just the plain notation of the fact, no payment, as though the absence of payment was simply one of the possible outcomes of the transaction, no more notable than the receipt of eggs. She turned to the front of the ledger, the inside cover. One line written in the center of the page in the same hand as everything else. Winifred Vance, seamstress. This is my work. This is my record. The flashlight beam steadied on the page. Loretta's hand did not. 72 years. Her mother had not left. Or if she had left, she had not gone far. She had been here in this town, in this container, working. Sewing coats for children whose families paid in eggs and apples. Accepting nothing from families who had nothing to give, keeping precise records of every transaction in a green hardcover ledger from October 1952 to she turned quickly to the last entry. March 1971, 18 years. Her mother had been in Caldwell Hollow for 18 years after the morning she didn't come back, and nobody had told Loretta. Not one person, Not the Hearn family, not the Briggs family, not the Watts family, not anyone whose name was in this ledger. She closed the ledger. She pressed it against her chest, both arms wrapped around it, and stood in the center of the container in the beam of Gerald's flashlight, with the singer behind her and the shelves on either side, and the cold evening air coming in through the open doors, and she did not cry. Not yet. Because the crying required a complete picture, and she did not yet have a complete picture. What she had was a beginning. What she had was evidence. What she had was the inside cover of a ledger with her mother's name on it and the declaration in careful left slanting script that this was her work and her record. What she didn't yet have was the why. Why had Winifred Vance stayed in Caldwell Hollow and not come back? Why had she been here 3 miles from the house on Sycamore Ridge Road, sewing for every family in town for 18 years in a shipping container? She had turned into a workshop and never once knocked on the door. The answers were here. She could feel them in the weight of the unopened boxes in the shelves she hadn't cleared yet, in the container's organized and purposeful silence. They had been waiting for someone with bolt cutters and $3 in the specific stubbornness of a woman who had spent 43 years refusing to leave before she understood what was wrong. Loretta set the ledger on the workbench. She turned back to the shelves. There were more boxes. She began to open them. The boxes on the lower shelf were fabric. She had already established that. Cotton prints and wool remnants and bolts of muslin folded with the same precision as everything else in the container, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed and brittled with age but had done its job, had kept the fabric from the worst of the dust and the damp. She moved through them systematically the way she had always worked, left to right, top to bottom. No box skipped, no assumption made about what was important before she had seen everything. The third box on the lower shelf held pattern pieces. Tissue paper patterns, the commercial kind, from the 1950s, cut from their envelopes and pinned together into the shapes of finished garments. Children's dresses, a woman's blouse, a man's work shirt with a note pinned to the front piece in the familiar handwriting, add 1 inch at shoulder RH measures wide. Whoever RH was, Winifred Vance had known his measurements and adjusted her patterns accordingly. She had known her customers well enough to carry their bodies in her head. The fourth box held finished garments she hadn't yet examined. More of the same careful work, more of the red thread tags, more names from the ledger made physical and tangible. A wool coat for a child size 8, the lining stitched in a blue plaid that someone had chosen for beauty rather than necessity, because lining didn't show. And no one would know it was there except the child wearing it, who would know every time they put it on. A small extravagance, invisible to everyone but the recipient. Loretta held the coat in the flashlight beam and looked at that lining for a long time. Then she reached the boxes at the back of the lower shelf. There were 7 of them, pushed further back than the others, sitting in a row, with a deliberateness that was different from the organized practicality of the rest of the shelving. These boxes had been placed here with intention, not filed, set apart. She pulled the first one down. Inside, a dress, children's size 7 cotton, the blue flowers on white ground, folded with the same care as everything else but wrapped in an extra layer of tissue paper, doubled as though this particular garment had required additional protection. A tag sewn into the collar seam, red thread on white cotton, the familiar left slanting hand. Made for Loretta. She read it twice. Then she set the dress down on the workbench very carefully, the way you set down things that might break if you aren't paying attention, and she pulled down the second box. Size 8, a different fabric, a green and white check summer weight, same tag, made for Loretta. Third box, size 9, a rust-colored corduroy with brass buttons, a fall dress, the kind you wore to school when the weather turned. Same tag. Fourth box, size 10, a blue wool dress with a white collar, the kind of dress you wore to church. Same tag. Fifth box, size 11, a yellow cotton print with a smocked bodice, the kind of detail that took hours and served no structural purpose whatsoever, that existed purely as an expression of love rendered in needle and thread. Made for Loretta. Sixth box, size 12. Seventh box, size 13. 7 dresses, 1 for every year from 1952 to 1958. Sizes 7 through 13. Each one in a different fabric, each one made with the same impossible care. Each one with the same tag, and each one never worn, never delivered. Folded in tissue paper in the back of a container in the Caldwell County impound lot, waiting in the dark for 11 years on top of however many years they had waited before that. Loretta sat down on the folding cot. The cot held. It had been built to hold. She picked up the first dress, the size 7, the blue flowers on white, and held it in both hands in the beam of the flashlight. The fabric was the same fabric as the piece she had found in the first box. Of course it was. Her mother had kept the fabric and made the dress from it, the dress that a 7-year-old girl would have worn if things had gone differently, if one Tuesday morning in September of 1952 had gone differently. She pressed the dress to her face. Nothing. 72 years had taken the scent completely. There was only dust and age and the faint mineral smell of the tissued paper. But she kept it pressed against her face for a long moment anyway, because the 7-year-old who still lived somewhere inside her 79-year-old body needed to do it. And Loretta Vance had spent enough time in hospitals to know that the body's needs, even the old irrational ones, deserved to be honored. Then she put the dress down and stood up and went to find the rest of what this container had to tell her. She had been methodical about the fabric boxes and the garment boxes. She was less methodical now. She pulled boxes from shelves faster, opened them with less ceremony. Not careless, but urgent, the way you become urgent when you know the answer is close and the light is failing, and you have a 79-year-old body that is going to start insisting on rest within the next hour, regardless of what your mind wants. 2 more boxes of finished garments. 1 box of notions thread and needles and a pincushion shaped like a tomato, the stuffing hardened with age, and a pair of scissors with handles worn smooth from years of use. 1 box of receipts, handwritten carbons of what she supposed were the business records reflected in the green ledger. She set that box aside. Then she found the second ledger. It was on the lowest shelf behind everything else, pushed to the back where it was not visible unless you were specifically looking. Smaller than the business ledger. Dark red cover, no label on the spine, the corners worn to the cardboard beneath the cloth. Not a business record. The size and format were wrong for accounts. This was personal. A journal. She sat on the floor again, not because her legs gave out this time, but because the floor was where she was and it didn't matter anymore. She opened the cover. The handwriting was the same, but the register was different. The business ledger had been written in the careful, controlled hand of someone making an official record. This was the same penmanship, but released from formality. The letters still precise, but moving faster, slightly. More urgent, the hand of someone writing, because they needed to, rather than because they were required to. The first entry was dated September 14th, 1952. I am writing this because no one will believe me if I only speak. Harlan has told everyone that I left. He has told Loretta that I chose to go. He has told the people at church and the people at the post office and everyone who asked that I walked out of my own accord and left my family behind because I wanted something else, something more, some life that didn't include the life we had built together. That is not what happened. On September 9th, a Tuesday, I came home from the Hendersons where I had been helping with their fall canning, which I had done every September for 4 years. I came home at 3:30, the same time I always came home. My key did not work. I tried it 3 times the way you do when you cannot believe what the evidence is telling you. The key did not work because the lock had been changed. Harlan came to the door when I knocked. He stood on the other side of the screen and told me I was not to come in. He told me I was not to contact Loretta. He told me that if I attempted to see my daughter, he would call the police and tell them I was unstable, that I had been unstable for some time, that he had documentation. He has a friend at the county sheriff's office. He has had that friend for 15 years. I know what that means. I know what it meant in 1952 for a woman to be called unstable by her husband in a town where everyone knew his name. I went to the church. I asked for help. What happened at the church I will write later when I can write it without my hand shaking. I found this container at the old rail yard on Hollow Creek Road. It had been there for 2 years at least, sitting on the siding, unclaimed, unlocked. I cleaned it. I moved my Singer, which was mine before I was ever Harlan's wife, which I had owned since 1941, and which he had no legal claim to, though I moved it at night to be sure. I brought what fabric I had saved. I set up the workbench with lumber from the old Perkins barn that Clarence Perkins said I could take because he was done with it. I sew. It is what I know. It is what I can offer. The families here need clothes and cannot always buy them, and I can make what they need and they can give what they have, and we can make that into something that works. I have been doing this informally for years. Now I am doing it formally from this container in the rail yard with a ledger and a system and the understanding that this is not temporary. This is how I will live until something changes. Something will change. It has to. Loretta looked up from the journal. The flashlight beam was steady on the page. Outside the open doors, full dark had arrived. The impound lot was silent. She could see stars through the opening, the cold March stars of the Kentucky Hill Country, the same stars that had been above Caldwell Hollow in September of 1952 when Winifred Vance had come home to a changed lock. She turned the page. September 28th, 1952. The church will not help. I knew this before I went back a second time, but I needed to know it for certain. Mrs. Opal Guthrie, who I have known for 20 years, who sat beside me at every church potluck for 2 decades, who knew me as a young woman and knew me as a wife and knew me as a mother, called the police the first time I came to ask for help. She called them and they came and they called Harlan, and Harlan told them what he had told me he would tell them, and they believed him. They believed him immediately, completely, without asking me a single question that was not already answered in their minds before I opened my mouth. Harlan has since spoken to someone at the church. I do not know exactly what was said. I know that Mrs. Guthrie will allow me to use the basement to wash on Tuesday mornings when no one else is there. She leaves the side door unlocked. We do not speak. She does not look at me when she passes the door and sees me there. This is the compromise she has made with herself, and I accept it because I am not in a position to require more than she is willing to give. Loretta stopped. Read the passage again. Then sat with it for a moment. Opal Guthrie, she knew that name. Opal Guthrie had been a fixture of First Baptist for 60 years, her name on a plaque near the door for her decades of service. Her photograph in the church history book that sat in the vestibule on a little wooden stand. Loretta had walked past that plaque and that photograph hundreds of times. Opal Guthrie had died in 2011, according to what Pastor Delia would later tell her in her 90s, having carried what she knew for nearly 6 decades. Loretta had walked past the woman's memorial plaque without ever knowing what the woman had done and left undone. She turned more pages. Read faster now, not because the handwriting had become easier, but because her eyes had adapted and because urgency had replaced patience. October 1952. November. December. The journal moved through the first winter in the container. Winifred had insulated the walls with salvaged materials, cardboard and old feed sacks, and a wool blanket donated without questions by a woman named Ruth Cassidy, who asked only that her name not be written down anywhere. The kerosene lamp provided heat as well as light. The treadle singer required no electricity. She had solved the practical problems of her situation with the same methodical intelligence that was evident in every other aspect of how she had organized the space. But the personal entries were different from the practical ones. February 4th, 1953. I watched Loretta walk to school this morning. She goes at 7:45. She carries a blue lunchbox with a clasp that sticks. She has to push it with her thumb to get it to close. I can see her doing this from where I stand at the end of Fern Creek Road. She walks with Margaret Briggs. They talk the whole way. She looks healthy. She looks fed and warm, and her coat fits properly. This is what I need to know, and it is not enough, and I know it is not enough, and I do not know what to do with the gap between what I need and what I have. March 12th, 1953. I have been in this container for 6 months. Harlan has told people I moved to Lexington. I heard this from Ruth Cassidy, who hears everything and tells me the parts I need to know because she has made her own quiet decision about where justice lies in this situation. People believe it because it is a tidy explanation, and people prefer tidy explanations. Nobody asks where I am living or how. Nobody asks because the asking would require them to care about the answer, and caring about the answer would require them to do something, and doing something would cost them something they are not willing to pay. I do not blame them. I understand how the arithmetic of courage works in a small town in 1953. Loretta turned to 1955, June 7th, 1955. Is 10 years old. She lost her 2 front teeth in February, and they have grown back crooked slightly. The right one turned just a little toward the center. I noticed this from the end of Fern Creek Road, and I have been thinking about it since. Her grandmother had the same tooth turned the same way. There are things, Mom, that come through blood regardless of who raises you. I find this comforting in a way I cannot fully explain. I have made her a summer dress, yellow cotton, which is her color. I know this because she gravitates toward it when she has a choice. When she picks flowers, she picks the yellow ones. When the school colors were voted on, I heard from Ruth that Loretta argued for gold and yellow. She does not know this is her color in any conscious way. She just knows she is drawn to it. The dress is a size 10, which is what she needs now based on what I can observe. I have put it in the box with the others. There are 4 dresses now. I do not know why I continue to make them. I know I will continue to make them. Then the entry that cracked something open in Loretta's chest that she had kept sealed for 7 decades. September 9th, 1955. 3 years since the lock was changed. I have thought many times about simply going to the door. Walking up to the house on Sycamore Ridge Road and knocking and refusing to leave. I know the risks. I know what Harlan would do, and I know that the police would come, and I know what the police would say, and I know what the town would decide. A woman declared unstable who has been living in a rail yard container for 3 years is not a sympathetic figure in Caldwell Hollow in 1955. She is a story that confirms the decision that was made about her. But here's the thing, I keep arriving at the thing I cannot move past. If I go to the door and the police come and they take me in the court sides with Harlan, which it will, then I lose any chance of seeing Loretta grow up. From the end of Fern Creek Road, I can see her every morning. From the end of Fern Creek Road, I have watched her grow 3 inches in 3 years and learn to carry her books differently and start to wear her hair pulled back instead of loose. From the end of Fern Creek Road, I am still in some reduced and inadequate and unbearable way her mother. If I go to the door, I lose Fern Creek Road. Some mathematics have no good answers, only less bad ones. Loretta set the journal down on her knee. She was sitting on the floor of the container, with her back against the workbench and her legs stretched out in front of her, and Gerald's flashlight balanced on the workbench edge so that the beam fell onto the open pages without her having to hold it. The night was fully dark outside. The cold had gotten into the container now that the day's thin warmth was gone. She was not aware of the cold. She picked up the journal again. She skipped forward, not missing entries, but scanning, looking for the shape of things, the arc of 18 years compressed into a journal she could hold in both hands. 1957. Harlan has been elected to the County Roads Committee. His name in the paper. Ruth cut it out and brought it to me, not to hurt, but to inform. Knowledge is safer than ignorance, even knowledge that hurts. 1958. Something has happened. She stopped on that entry, October 14th, 1960. Harlan came to see Mrs. Guthrie at the church. I know this because Ruth Cassidy saw his truck outside and told me. I do not know exactly what was said. I know that after this visit, Mrs. Guthrie left a note in the split of the fence post at the end of Fern Creek Road, which is how we communicate when she needs to tell me something she cannot say directly. The note said I can no longer leave the door. She did not explain. She did not need to explain. Harlan had gotten to her. He had said something or offered something or threatened something, and whatever it was enough to close the one door that had remained open. I have not been able to wash properly since. Ruth lets me use her sink when her husband is away on the road, which is 3 weeks a month. This is what my life is. I am not complaining. I am recording. Loretta turned pages with hands that were no longer entirely steady. 1964. The entries became more sparse as the years passed, not because less was happening, but because Winifred had said what needed saying and did not require repetition to document the shape of her days. The sewing continued, the ledger continued, the watching from the end of Fern Creek Road continued. 1962, July 3rd, 1964. Loretta is 19. She is going to college in the fall, nursing program at Eastern Kentucky. I heard this from Ruth, who heard it from the Briggs girl who was the same age and going herself. I made Loretta's enrollment day in my mind, the boxes and the bedding and the drive to Richmond, and I let myself imagine it in full detail the way I sometimes do, because imagining is not the same as doing, and it costs me nothing except the re-entry the moment when the imagining ends and the container is still here, and the flashlight is burning low, and the work is on the bench where it always is. She is going to be a nurse. This is exactly right. Exactly. She was always the child who wanted to fix things, who couldn't pass an injured bird without trying to help. who asked why before she asked anything else. I am so proud of her, I cannot put it in a sentence that contains the actual size of it. Loretta stopped reading. She was crying now. Not gently, the way you cry when something has been held back for a very long time, and the holding is finished when the structure you built to manage the pressure of it has met something it cannot manage and given way all at once. The raw, full-body grief of a woman who had spent her entire adult life with a wound she had been told was her mother's choice and had just discovered it was her father's. She let it come. She had learned in 43 years of nursing that the body knew when it needed to do this, and fighting it cost more than allowing it. When it passed, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her wool coat and picked up the journal and turned to the last third, 1969. Winifred's handwriting had changed. Still recognizable, is still fundamentally the same but slower, more deliberate, the slight tremor of a woman in her late 50s who had spent decades driving a needle through heavy fabric and with hands that were beginning to feel the cost of that work. The entries noted this matter-of-factly. My hands are slower now. I thread the needle in better light. And then the entry that explained the end. March 3rd, 1971. I am 61 years old. My hands shake in the cold. The needle is harder to thread in the mornings. I have been here for 18 years and I have sewn, by the count of the business ledger, 2,114 garments for families in this county, and I do not regret a single stitch. I am leaving Caldwell Hollow. There is a women's residence in Berea run by the Methodist Church for women of limited means. Ruth has arranged a room for me. She has been arranging it for the past year quietly, the way she does everything without announcement. She told me last week that it was ready when I was ready. I am ready. I have been ready for some time, but I did not know how to leave the end of Fern Creek Road. I know that Loretta is 25 now and is working at Caldwell Regional and has a life that does not include me, not because she does not want me, but because she does not know to want me, because Harlan made sure she had no reason to look. I have watched her as much as a woman can watch from the end of a road, and I believe she is whole. I believe she is strong. I believe she is exactly the woman I watched her becoming from a distance I could not cross. I am leaving the container as it is. The machine, the fabric, the ledger, the work. I am taking only my clothes and my Bible and leaving everything else because this is where it belongs. This is where everything happened. If Loretta ever finds this place, if she ever reads these words, I want her to know this. She stopped reading. Turned the page. The last entry. March 18th, 1971. I saw her this morning. She was going into the hospital on the early shift, the 6 o'clock shift, and I was at the end of Fern Creek Road for the last time. She was wearing her uniform, white with the blue stripe at the collar that Caldwell Regional uses. She was walking quickly the way she always walks, with her shoulders held the same way I hold mine, the same set, the same angle, the forward lean of a person who is going somewhere with purpose. She looked like me. I wanted to call out. I have wanted to call out for 18 years. Some doors once closed can only be opened from the inside. I closed no doors, but I could not open the ones that were closed for me. I could only stay close enough to see through them, and I did that for as long as I could, and it was not enough, and it was everything I had, and I gave it without reservation. I am leaving now. The machine stays. The work stays. If you find this, Loretta, you should know that every stitch in every garment in this container was made by hands that were thinking of you. Every dress I could not deliver was a year I could not hold you. The blue flowers on white was the first fabric you ever touched. Sitting in my lap, pressing your face against my hip. I remember. I will always remember. Come find me if you can. I will be harder to find than this container, but I was always here. I never left this town for 18 years. I never stopped watching. I never stopped making the dresses. Every stitch was a letter I couldn't send. I love you. Your mother, Winifred. The flashlight was still balanced on the edge of the workbench. The beam fell across the last page of the journal, across her mother's signature, across the date March 18th, 1971, across the period at the end of the final sentence. Loretta sat on the floor of the container with the journal in her hands and the 7 dresses in boxes on the workbench, and the singer behind her in the dark, and understood with the completeness of a thing that cannot be disputed once it is known the full shape of what had been done. Harlan Vance had changed a lock. He had made one phone call to one friend at the sheriff's office. He had told one lie, the lie of instability, the lie that cost him nothing in 1952 because the year and the place and the machinery of the time made it free, made it available, made it the most efficient tool for a man who needed a woman to disappear. He had spent perhaps one or two conversations worth of effort purchasing the silence of the church. He had made one visit to Opal Guthrie in 1960 to close the last open door. That was all it had taken. For that, for the cost of a changed lock and two conversations, Winifred Vance had spent 18 years in a shipping container, had raised her daughter from the end of a road, had sewn 2,114 garments for the families of Caldwell Hollow, the same families who had accepted the garments and eaten the dinners and gone to the church and said nothing, not to Loretta, not to anyone, nothing for 18 years, and then for the 53 years after that. 200 families in this town had known her mother was alive and nearby and working, and not one of them had told a 7-year-old girl that her mother was 3 miles away sewing dresses for her that she would never wear. She sat with that for a long time in the cold and the dark. Then she got up, gathered the journal and the business ledger, took the box with the 7 dresses under her arm, and walked out of the container into the cold March night and the indifferent stars of Caldwell Hollow. She had what she needed. Now she needed to know who else had known. She did not go to the church that night. She drove back to the room she was renting by the week from a woman named Carol Sims on Birch Hollow Road, a room with a single bed and a radiator that knocked all night and a window that looked out on a stand of bare winter oaks, and she set the ledger and the journal and the box of 7 dresses on the small table by the window and sat in the chair beside them and did not sleep. She was not agitated. That was the thing she noticed most about herself as the night went on and the radiator knocked and the oaks stood black against the lightning sky. She was not shaking, not pacing, not in the grip of the kind of fury that announces itself loudly and burns fast. What she felt was slower and heavier and more durable than fury. It was the specific weight of a woman who has been carrying a false story for 72 years and has just set it down and is now feeling for the first time the full shape of what she was actually carrying all along. She had believed since she was 7 years old that her mother had chosen to leave. That was the stone at the foundation of everything. Not grief exactly, not abandonment in the simple emotional sense. Something more structural. The belief that she had been found insufficient, that her mother had looked at her life, which included a 7-year-old daughter, and had decided that whatever was on the other side of the door was worth more than what was on this side. That belief had shaped things, had shaped how she held herself, how she moved through relationships, how she had raised Cresswell, how she had explained to herself the moments in her life when she felt, without being able to name why, that she was waiting for someone to confirm what her father had told her at 9 years old, that people left because they chose to, that it was a matter of want. None of it had been true. She sat with that through the night. She did not try to resolve it or metabolize it or convert it into something more manageable. She was 79 years old and she had been a nurse for 43 years, and she knew that some things needed time, that they were going to take regardless of what you preferred, and the only productive response was to let them take it. By the time the winter light came through the window and fell across the box of 7 dresses on the table, she knew what she was going to do next. She was going to the church. Pastor Delia Pruitt was 38 years old and had been at First Baptist Caldwell for 6 years, which meant she had not been there when any of this happened and had not been alive for most of it, and had inherited whatever the church carried from those years, the way you inherit a house, not knowing which walls are load-bearing until you start trying to change things. Loretta had called ahead. She had not explained why she needed to meet, only that she did, and Delia had said 7 o'clock in the morning without hesitation, because that was the kind of pastor she was. Loretta arrived at 6:55. The church was the same building it had been in 1952, the same white clapboard and the same green doors and the same plaque near the entrance with the names of long service members etched in bronze. Opal Guthrie's name was third from the top. Loretta stood in front of the plaque for a moment before she went inside. She looked at the name. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She felt only the old woman's math of a life lived with something the way you lived with a stone in your shoe for long enough that you stopped feeling it as pain and started feeling it as simply the shape of walking. Harlan Vance's name was not on any plaque in that building. He had served on the County Roads Committee and been a deacon for 12 years, and his name was nowhere in that church because when he died, there had been nothing anyone wanted to memorialize. That was not justice, it took golly, but it was something. Opal Guthrie had lived with what she knew for nearly 6 decades. Then she had died with most of it except for what she had passed to Delia in 2011. Loretta went inside. Delia was in the small office off the vestibule, standing behind her desk with her hands flat on the surface and an expression that said she had been thinking about what this meeting might be since the phone call. She was a compact woman with close-cropped hair and the kind of still attentive eyes that Loretta associated with good nurses and good clergy, the people who had learned to be present to difficulty without being consumed by it. Loretta sat down across the desk without preamble and put the business ledger and the personal journal on the surface between them. "I need to ask you something directly," Loretta said, "and I need you to answer me the same way." Delia looked at the ledger, at the journal, then at Loretta. "All right. Did the church know that my mother was living in that container on Hollow Creek Road?" The silence that followed was brief. A good person's silence, not the silence of evasion, but the silence of someone deciding how to carry a truth they have been holding for someone else. "My grandmother knew," Delia said. "Opal Guthrie was my grandmother." Loretta did not move. "Tell me what she told you." Delia sat down. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at them for a moment, then looked up. "She told me when she was dying, 2011. She had been trying to tell me for years, I think, and kept not doing it, and then, at the end, she decided she couldn't take it with her. She said it was the one thing in her life she would redo if she could." "What did she tell you?" "That your mother came to the church in September of 1952. That she came to ask for help, for someone to intervene with your father, for someone to act as a witness or a mediator, or simply to stand beside her while she tried to get back into the house. My grandmother called the police instead. She said she did it because Harlan Vance was a deacon and had been a deacon for 12 years, and she believed the church's stability required his goodwill." Delia paused. "She said she knew that was the wrong reason even as she was making the call. She said she knew it and did it anyway. And then my father came to see her in 1960. Delia looked up. "You found the journal." "I found the journal." A long breath. "Yes, he came in 1960. He didn't bring money according to my grandmother. He brought something she said was worse. He brought the threat of shame. He told her that if she continued to assist your mother, he would make it known that the church had been aware of an unstable woman living illegally on the rail yard property for 8 years and had done nothing. He told her the liability would fall on the congregation. She believed him. She withdrew the basement access." Delia's voice was level, but her hands were not. "She told me she withdrew it and then went home and sat in her kitchen for 3 hours and did nothing. Because nothing was what the situation cost her, and action was what it would have cost. 200 families in this town knew my mother was alive," Loretta said. "Not one of them told a child that her mother was 3 miles away." "I know. And they took her coats and her dresses and her children's shirts, and they paid her in eggs and apples, and they sat in this building every Sunday and sang hymns, and they let a little girl grow up believing she had been left." "I know." Delia's voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had shifted a quality of weight of bearing witness without flinching. "My grandmother knew she had been a coward. She used that word. She said I was a coward, Delia, and I let a woman be erased from her daughter's life for the price of keeping things comfortable. And I have to tell you because someone has to know, and it should be you, and it should be Loretta Vance if she ever comes asking." Loretta sat with that for a moment. "She was still in Caldwell Hollow for 18 years, Loretta said. "She left in March of 1971 for a Methodist residence in Berea. She would have been 61. "I can help you find records," Delia said immediately. "Berea is 40 minutes. The Methodist church there keeps archives. If she was a resident, we can find out." "She died before I found her," Loretta said. "Not a question, a statement of probability. A calculation made by a woman who understood timelines and actuarial reality. Her mother had been born around 1910. It was 2024. But I want to know when and where and whether there is a grave with her name on it that I can stand in front of." "We will find it," Delia said, "whatever it takes." The pause that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the pause of two women sitting with the full weight of something that had been too heavy for one of them to carry alone. "What do you want to do?" Delia said. "With what you found, with all of it." Loretta looked at the ledger on the desk. At the 200 names inside it, the eggs and apples and firewood, and no payment, the careful accounting of a woman who had turned deprivation into service and kept doing it for 18 years without acknowledgement or recognition, or the one thing she actually wanted, which was simply to be her daughter's mother. "I want to show them," Loretta said. "All of them. The families in that ledger and their children and their grandchildren. I want them to see what she did and what was done to her, and I want them to stand in front of those 7 dresses and understand what silence costs." Delia looked at her steadily. "I'll give you the church hall." "I know you will," Loretta said. "You owe her that." "Yes," Delia said, "we do." The exhibition took 2 weeks to prepare, and Loretta prepared it herself. She cleaned the singer first. She had never operated an industrial sewing machine and did not intend to start now, but she cleaned it the way she would have cleaned a patient who had been left too long without proper care, methodically and with attention and without rushing the process. The rust on the exterior surfaces she addressed with fine steel wool. The mechanical parts she left alone because they moved when she turned the hand wheel, and moving parts that worked did not need intervention. She oiled the contact points from the can of machine oil she found on the workbench, shelf small and patient applications, with a cloth she cut from a muslin remnant. She sorted the garments from the boxes and pressed each one with a borrowed iron, working on the table in the church basement. The fabrics were old, but they were good fabric chosen by someone who understood that cheap material was a false economy when the point was durability. The stitching held. Every seam was as tight as the day it was sewn. 70 years of folded darkness had not changed what Winifred Vance's hands had made. She set the business ledger open on a reading stand at the entry point so that the first thing people saw when they walked in was the handwriting, the dates, the names, the payments. Alice Hearn, the Briggs children, Dewey Watts, the no payment entries regular as punctuation, the rhythm of a woman who understood that some things mattered more than accounts. She hung the finished garments on a long rack along one wall. Each one still wore its red thread tag, and along the back wall of the church hall, she strung a length of clothesline between 2 hooks that Delia's husband installed without being asked why. On the clothesline, she hung the 7 dresses in order of size smallest to largest left to right, size 7 to size 13. Blue flowers on white to yellow cotton to rust corduroy to blue wool to yellow print, with smocking to the 2 larger ones at the end, each one a year, each one a sewn, each one made by hands that had no other way to reach. She stood in the empty hall the evening before the exhibition opened and looked at the 7 dresses on the line. They were as objects, simple things, cotton and wool and thread and the labor of careful hands. But hung in order of size, smallest to largest, they produced an effect that was not simple at all. They were a timeline. They were the shape of a childhood measured in fabric by a woman who could not be there for the childhood itself, who had been kept from it by a changed lock and a phone call, and the willingness of a town to let comfort outweigh truth. 7 dresses, 7 years, every one of them made for a girl who never wore them. Loretta stood in front of them for a long time in the quiet hall with the evening light coming through the high windows, and she felt for the first time since she had opened the container 2 weeks ago, something that was not grief or fury or the exhausted clarity of a woman processing a 72-year lie. She felt her mother, not as a memory, not as a reconstruction, as a presence. The presence of someone who had loved her from the end of a road, who had threaded a needle by lamplight in a metal container and made dresses for a daughter she couldn't reach year after year, size after size, because love doesn't stop working just because someone locks the door. She opened the exhibition at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning in March, 11 years and 2 weeks from the date the container had been seized and impounded. Alice Hearn was the first person through the door. She was 83 years old and walked with a cane and had the look of a woman who had been beautiful in youth and knew it and had long since moved past caring. She walked into the hall and stopped in front of the reading stand with the open ledger and read the first visible entry and put her free hand over her mouth. October 3rd, 1952, Loretta said from across the room. Winter coat wool children size 6, 2 dozen eggs. Alice Hearn looked up. Her eyes were full. I wore that coat for 3 winters, she said. My mother told me a friend had made it. She never said who. A pause. I think my mother knew. I think a lot of mothers knew. Yes, Loretta said. I think so too. They kept coming through the morning. The Briggs family sent 3 generations, the 80-year-old daughter of the original Briggs children, in the ledger, her son, her granddaughter. They stood in front of the garment rack and found the shirts with the Briggs tag, and the granddaughter, who was maybe 25 and had driven 2 hours from Lexington, held one of the shirts and looked at the red thread stitching and said nothing for a long time. A man named Curtis Lattimore came alone, said nothing to anyone, stood in front of the open ledger and turned pages for 20 minutes, and then left an envelope on the reading stand that Delia later opened and found contained a check for $3,000 made out to First Baptist Caldwell with a note that said, for whatever she would have wanted it for. Then an hour before noon, the door opened and a woman in her late 50s came in carrying something folded in her arms. She stopped in the middle of the hall and looked at Loretta. I'm Cecilia Watts, she said. Dewey Watts was my father. Loretta knew the name. Dewey Watts work trousers, patched and resized, no payment, family, and hardship. She had read his name in the ledger a dozen times in the past 2 weeks. He kept a shirt, Cecilia said. He kept it his whole life. When we cleaned out his house after he died in the 2019, we found it in a cedar chest at the back of his closet. We didn't know where it came from. He never told us. She held out what she was carrying. It was a boy's work shirt, cotton dark blue, the fabric worn pale at the elbows and collar from years of handling. The stitching at the seams was intact. Not a single thread had pulled. Loretta took it, turned it over, found the collar seam and looked at the tag. Made for Dewey Watts. No payment. And below that, in a slightly lighter ink, added later, 2 lines in the same hand. Good boy. Will go far. Loretta looked up at Cecilia Watts. My father was mayor of Caldwell Hollow for 18 years, Cecilia said. Her voice was steady, but her chin was not. He never knew who made this shirt. He kept it because his mother told him it was made by someone who cared. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. He would have wanted to know. He would have wanted to thank her. She knew, Loretta said. She watched this town for 18 years. She knew who your father became. Cecilia Watts stood in the middle of the church hall holding her father's shirt and cried the standing up crying of a woman who has just understood something about her father's life that reframes everything she thought she knew about where he came from and who helped him get there. 87 people came that first day. Some were old enough to remember Winifred Vance vaguely the way you remembered shapes at the edge of things, a woman at the end of a road, a woman whose name came up in conversation and was quickly changed away from. Some had garments she had made still in their closets, still intact, brought out for christenings and first days of school because the stitching held and good things were kept. One man brought a quilt. A woman brought a dress her mother had been married in. Each one had a tag. Each one had a name. And each one stood at some point during the day in front of the 7 dresses on the clothesline. Standing there, most of them went quiet in the same way. Not the quiet of discomfort or the quiet of not knowing what to say. The quiet of understanding. The quiet of a person looking at the evidence of something and having no defense against what the evidence meant. 7 dresses, 7 years, never delivered, never worn, hanging on a clothesline in a church hall in Caldwell. Hollow, Kentucky in March of 2024, 72 years after the lock was changed. Cresswell came at 2 in the afternoon. He came without Margette. He came in his work clothes, the clothes he wore when he wasn't performing the version of himself that Margette's household required: jeans and a canvas jacket, and the boots he'd had for 12 years that Loretta had always liked because they told the truth about what kind of man he actually was when no one was requiring him to be something else. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in. Loretta saw him from across the hall and did not go to him. She let him walk the room at his own pace, let him read the ledger entries, let him look at the garments on the rack with their red thread tags, let him turn and find the back wall and the clothesline and the 7 dresses. She watched his face from across the room. He stood in front of the dresses for a long time. She could see even from across the hall the moment when it fully arrived. The moment when the thing he was looking at became the thing it actually was, and his face did what faces do when shame and love arrive at the same time and occupy the same space. It broke along lines she hadn't known were there. Slowly, the way ice breaks in the thaw, first the surface and then deeper. He turned and found her. She crossed the hall and stood in front of her son and waited. Mom, he said. His voice had the sound of something that had been prepared and then abandoned. I didn't know any of this. I know you didn't. About your grandmother, about what your father did. He stopped, tried again. About any of it. No, Loretta said, but you knew something else. He looked at her. You knew what Margette was doing, she said. Her voice was the voice she had used for 43 years to tell people true things they needed to hear. Not unkind, not soft either. The voice that respected someone enough to be straight with them. You knew she was pushing me out, and you let it happen. You stood in the kitchen, and you told her it was your house too, and then you decided it wasn't worth the fight. She looked at her son, the good man with the 12-year boots and the Sunday phone calls and the spine that bent when it should have held. Your grandmother had her door locked by a man who had made a decision. You left mine open and then watched someone else push me through it. Different words, same door. Cresswell didn't flinch from it. That was the thing she noticed. He had flinched from Margette's displeasure for 11 years, had accommodated and adjusted and managed and retreated. He did not flinch from his mother's truth. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to fix your marriage, Loretta said. That's yours to figure out. I'm asking you to decide what kind of man you want to be when the door is in front of you. What can I do, he said. Right now, what can I do? She looked at him for a moment. Come back next Saturday. Bring your tools. He came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and every Saturday for the following month. He built display cases for the garments along the hall wall, glass-fronted cases on solid frames. The kind of cases that said these things mattered, that they deserved protection. He built a proper stand for the singer, raised it 6 inches so that people could see the full treadle mechanism without bending. He refinished the oak cabinet by hand-patient work with sandpaper and oil until the wood that had been dulled by decades in a container came back to something like its original warmth. And he framed the 7 dresses. He did it himself, measuring and cutting and constructing shadowbox frames deep enough to hold each dress without compression, mounting them on archival backing with the care of someone doing penance in the only language available to him, which was physical work done well and with attention. He hung them on the wall of the church hall, 7 frames in a row, smallest to largest. Then he made the plaques, 1 plaque for each dress, small and precise, mounted below the frame, and 1 long plaque beneath all 7 which read, Made for Loretta by her mother Winifred Vance, Caldwell Hollow, Kentucky, 1952 to 1958. Never delivered, never forgotten. He showed her before he hung it, held it up and looked at her and waited. She read it twice. Then she nodded. He hung it that afternoon. The Textile Museum in Nashville called 3 weeks after the exhibition opened. They had heard from Cecilia Watts, who had heard from the regional paper which had run a story that had been picked up by 2 larger outlets. They wanted the singer and 3 of the garments for a permanent exhibition on women's labor in post-war Appalachia. Loretta met with the curator on a Tuesday morning in the church hall. The curator was a careful woman named Dr. Sylvia Marsh, who moved through the space with the quiet reverence of someone in the presence of primary sources, touching nothing without permission, asking questions that showed she understood what she was looking at. The machine is extraordinary, Dr. Marsh said. The condition, the provenance, the documented production history through the ledger. This is a remarkable find. You can borrow 3 garments, Loretta said. Your choice of which 3? I'd recommend the Watts shirt. Dr. Marsh looked up. And the machine? The machine stays. A pause. Mrs. Vance, the museum, could provide significant resources for its preservation and display. The public access alone. That machine is my mother's hands, Loretta said. You can borrow the clothes. The hands stay with me. Dr. Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she said simply, of course. The church helped Loretta find an apartment 2 weeks after the exhibition opened. A subsidized unit in a building on Mill Creek Road, 1 bedroom and a kitchen, a living room with good morning light from east-facing windows. $650 a month, utilities included. The math worked. For the first time in 3 months, the math actually worked. She moved in on a Friday with 3 carloads of belongings and the singer. Cresswell carried the machine up the stairs himself, which required 2 of his friends from the post office and 40 minutes in language that Loretta pretended not to hear. They set it by the east window because that was where she told them to put it. When they were done and had gone and the apartment was quiet, she stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the singer in the morning light. She made coffee. She sat in the chair she had positioned beside the machine, and she put her hands around the warm mug and looked at the singer and let the morning happen around her. She had never learned to sew. Winifred had been gone before she was old enough to be taught, and Harlan had not kept the machine, had not kept anything that belonged to his wife, and so the skill had simply not been passed. There was a generation-shaped hole where that knowledge should have been. She did not grieve it. She had enough to carry. What she did each morning was sit beside the machine with her coffee and run her fingers over the surfaces. The hand-wheel smooth iron worn to a particular finish by decades of the same grip. The needle played a small oval of polished steel with the feed dogs rising through it. The tension dial numbered and firm. The treadle below the cast iron pedal that responded to the weight of a foot with the ancient mechanical leverage of something that had been engineered to last. She touched each part in the same order each morning. Not ritual exactly. More like the things she had done at the bedsides of patients who were no longer responsive, talking to them. Holding their hands, continuing the conversation because the conversation mattered, regardless of whether it was being heard. A week after she moved in, she found the Methodist Church residence records in Berea. Delia drove her. They sat in the archive room of the Berea Methodist Church on a Tuesday afternoon, while a volunteer named Henry located the records from the 1970s and brought them in a cardboard box. Loretta found the entry in 20 minutes. Winifred Vance arrived March 1971, age 61. She ran her finger along the line to the end. Departed July 1979, age 69. And in the notes column, the residence director's handwriting, passed peacefully. Buried Berea Municipal Cemetery section, C. Loretta looked at the date for a long time. 1979. She had been 34 years old in 1979. She had been working at Caldwell Regional for 9 years. She had been 40 minutes away. She had not known to look. She went to the cemetery on a Thursday in April when the Kentucky spring had finally arrived and the redbuds were out along the roads, and the morning was cold and clear and bright. Delia came with her and then understood without being told to stay at the car. Section C was in the older part of the cemetery, the section where the stones were modest and close together and the inscriptions were plain. She found the stone in the third row. Winifred Agnes Vance, 1910 to 1979. She worked with her hands. That was all. She worked with her hands. Loretta stood in front of the stone in the April light for a long time. She was aware of the redbuds along the fence line and the sound of a cardinal somewhere in the cemetery oaks, in the cold of the grass coming through the soles of her shoes. She was aware of being 79 years old and standing in a place she should have been able to stand decades ago and would have been able to stand if one man had not changed one lock on one Tuesday morning in September of 1952. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had prepared nothing. She had been a nurse for 43 years, and she knew that the things worth saying were rarely the things you prepared, that the truest language arrived in the moment and departed if you waited for a better one. I found the container, Mama, she said. I found the ledger and the journal and the 7 dresses. I found the blue flowers on white. She paused. I found what you left for me, and I understand what you were doing, and I know now that you didn't leave. I know you were watching from Fern Creek Road. I know you knew about the nursing school and the blue stripe at the collar and the early shift. She stopped, steadied. I sat with your journal for a whole night, and I understood by the morning the full size of what you gave me from a distance, which was everything, which was all of it. The same as if you'd been there, except you weren't, except you were as close as he would let you be, which was not close enough and was still somehow enough to make me who I am. The cardinal was in the oak directly above her now. She could hear it clearly. I found you, she said. 72 years late, but I found you. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the thing she had brought. A small piece of blue-flowered cotton cut from the edge of the fabric in the first box she had opened in the container, the piece that had broken something open in her the night she stood in the impound lot with Gerald's flashlight. She had cut a small square of it, hemmed the edges herself with needle and thread imperfectly, because she had never been taught. The stitching was crooked, and the tension was wrong, and it was by any measure bad sewing. It was the first thing she had ever made. She set it against the base of the headstone where the grass met the granite. Then she stood up and straightened her coat and turned back toward the car where Delia was waiting and walked through the April light in the direction of everything that was still ahead. She had lived with a false story for 72 years. She was not naive enough to believe that knowing the true one would simply replace it, that the architecture of a lifetime built on a lie would dissolve because the truth had finally been located. It would not work that way. She knew enough about how people functioned, had sat with enough of them at the boundaries of what they could bear to understand that repair was slower than damage and less dramatic and required showing up for it every day without the benefit of a clean narrative arc. But she had the singer now. She had the ledger. She had the journal and the 7 dresses framed on the wall of the church hall and the small imperfect square of blue-flowered cotton she had left against her mother's headstone. She had the mornings. Each morning the light came through the east windows of the apartment on Mill Creek Road and fell across the singer's hand wheel and the needle plate in the tension dial and the treadle below. Each morning, Loretta sat in the chair beside the machine with her coffee and ran her fingers over the surfaces in the same order. The wheel, the plate, the dial, the treadle. The machine did not answer. Machines did not answer. But the light moved across the needle in the way light moved across everything it found, without preference, without schedule, without requiring that you have earned it or understood it or arrived at the right moment. It came because that was what light did. It found the surfaces that were there and moved across them and was gone by noon and came again the next morning. Loretta was there to see it. That was enough. That was in the end exactly enough.